full of interesting people with wisdom and extraordinary experiences to learn from. Join me on a journey to discover them, speak with them, and learn from them. I'm Adrian Sinclair, host of A Podcast with Interesting People at apodcast.com. Welcome, friends. This is Adrian Sinclair with A Podcast with Interesting People. Today, my guest is Mr. Dean Nelson, and let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Dean Nelson. I have his book over here, which is my personal journalistic Bible right now, and it is Talk to Me: How to Ask Better Questions, Get Better Answers, and Interview Everyone and Anyone Like a Pro. Welcome to the show, Dean.
I'm so glad to be here. I'm honored, actually, to be here. So this is going to be fun.
I'm just going to read the from the back. Oops, sorry, wrong button. I'm going to read from the back over here about you a little bit, just to give the audience some background on what you've done, aside from writing this wonderful book. Mr. Dean Nelson is the founder and director of the journalism program at Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego. He is also a founder and host of the annual Writers' Symposium by the Sea, a 40-year veteran journalist. Mr. Nelson's byline has appeared in publications such as, there's so many of them over here, New York Times, Boston Globe, USA Today, San Jose Mercury News, just to name few. So I am really honored. It's my honor to have you on the show over here. Thank you for being here. And I'm looking forward to picking your brain in this journalistic domain.
Yeah, no, this is great. And welcome to the world of podcasting. This is, I admire what you're doing. I really do.
I picked up your book as I was starting to hone my skills and develop my skills doing podcasting. And I searched for a book that could, tutor me, give me a crash course on how to interview people. And although I'm trying to shy away from the word interview because it sounds more like an interrogation, I like the line in your book which said, if an interview is going so well that it feels like a conversation, then it's a great interview because it just feels like a conversation. And so this podcast is more of a long-form conversation versus an interview. But the wealth of information that I got from your book is just tremendous. So thank you for writing it for people like me who are trying to break into this industry.
Oh, that's great. I'm as I said, I'm honored and happy to talk further with you about it. But I do think any good interview is just a good conversation, because all you're trying to do is connect. That's what you're trying to do. You're just trying to connect with another human being at a level that's a little deeper than just how's the weather.
Right. The amount of experience that you have and the number of interviews that you've done with variety of different guests, I mean, it's overwhelming to think how many you've done, and it's actually kind of hard even for me to pick one to talk about. But I wanted to start with, how did you get into this? Do you remember the moment where you decided to start the symposium, the Writers' Summit? What kind of precipitated that, and how did you get into it?
It's a good question because I don't know what your life is like, but mine, the things that I've gotten into were not things that were the result of a plan, some grand plan that I had. It was more of a confluence of circumstances. So I'll just give you the real thumbnail of the Writers' Symposium. I'd already been teaching at this university, and some of my colleagues and I wanted to do something where we would bring in some good writers that maybe would inspire and model great writing for our students. And because of the work I had done for the Boston Globe on the U.S.-Mexico border right here, San Diego and Tijuana, I had read a book by he was kind of a crime writer. That's what he's known for, a guy named Joseph Wambaugh. And he lives in San Diego. and this book he had written called Lines and Shadows was about the border and about law enforcement down there. And it was so good and it was so interesting and so well written that I reached out to him. I contacted him. I said, hey, would you come to our school and give a talk, give a reading, and just help us understand what it is to be a great writer? And he wrote back just like maybe 2 lines. And he goes, his first opening line was, I'm sorry, but I don't do these kinds of things. And then second line was, but if somebody wants to ask me some questions, I can come and do that. So we thought, okay, let's bring him to campus anyway. We got a television studio to broadcast it, and I just went into this full Joseph Wambaugh immersion, trying to read everything he had done, try to chart his evolution as a writer, and it went unbelievably well. And the audience loved it, students loved it, members of the community loved it. It was great television. And when that was over, again, my colleagues and I just kind of met and said, that's a pretty good way to go, because we could bring in writers and they don't have to prepare anything. They just have to come. All the preparation's on me. And so we started doing that format, and it just kind of hit a stride. And this year will be our 25th year of doing these interviews with great writers. So that's how that thing began. I'd love to tell you, Adrian, that I'm so smart that I came up with this grand plan of how to do this, and that I had all of these focus groups and everything, and that it worked. But it's sort of like your podcast. I mean, you just did it because that was kind of the next opportunity for you, and in our case, this worked out.
So what made it successful? What made that first and then the following ones successful when you looked at your colleagues and said, wow, that really worked out? What were some of the things that you had in mind? Like, what made it? Was it how things clicked? Was it just the dynamics of this whole symposium? What were those top things for you?
No, that's a really important question, because we had to think about those very issues of what worked. And why did it work? And what do we even mean when we say that it worked? But I think it's a couple of things. One is there was a great dynamic. Wambaugh is a very interesting guy. He's very funny. And I felt like I had to bring my A game to this guy if he was going to respect the time that he was going to be spending with us. So there was that piece. There was just a really good dynamic. But when it was all over, when my interview with him was over, I felt like it was going to, it felt like going to a jazz club. And for this reason, there was, in a jazz club, there is so much improvisation that goes on. I mean, those musicians are really well prepared. They know the music, they know kind of where it's going to go. But then every now and then one of the soloists just takes off, and the rest of the band has to keep up and follow, and then kind of take off in their own direction. So that's kind of how this felt when I was interviewing Wambaugh, was this sense that, wow, who knows where this is going to go? And he spun off and told some anecdotes that he hasn't told publicly, and it was all because, in my view, it was all because I was prepared and kind of knew where to lead him. And then he could kind of take off on his own solo, and then the back and forth was just terrific. And I thought, okay, that's a good formula. That's a really good formula. But it's always a little bit risky because you don't know if everybody can do that. As I'm sure you've read in the book, I've had some that didn't go quite so well.
And in your book, you give so many examples that are wonderful, because you it's like it's a great like for me. I mean, I was thinking about how am I going to ask these questions, and the nervous part about interviewing someone or talking to someone is, for me at least, it was, what if I run out of questions? What if what if I don't have anything else to talk about or like ask, and have that pregnant pause, that moment of silence, which then you're like, ew, okay, what do we do? What do we do now? So how do we keep things interesting? Especially nowadays in the era of YouTube and podcasting and all these shows which are out there. What do you think are the sort of top things that you can recommend for things to keep them interesting?
Yeah, no, I do. I think every good interviewer probably has a little bit of fear that either what we talk about isn't going to be all that interesting, or they might run out of stuff to talk about, or probably the worst situation would be is if the person just gave 1 or 2 word answers, and so if that's the case, then you are going to run out of questions. At least for the interviews that I do with writers, well, really interviews that I do with anybody, I over prepare. So I write out my questions in advance, and as you know from the book, I try to put them in a certain order. And so I over prepare. I write way more questions than we could ever get to, and then the key, of course, is how you craft the question. If you ask it in an open-ended kind of way that invites a longer kind of response, or maybe an illustration or something like that, then you're going to get something interesting. You're going to get something a little deeper than the 1 or 2 word answers. Now, the danger, of course, is that you ask a question that's just so open-ended that it's just paralyzing. So let me give you an example. When my dad was being interviewed, my dad was a World War II veteran, and his assignment when he was in the Army was as a weatherman. So he was at a weather station up on the Arctic Circle. And he was up there for more than a year with just 5 guys. And every hour, 24 hours a day, they would have to send up some sort of a balloon and then they would report that what happened with that balloon to their superiors, so that would give the Allies some kind of a heads up of what the weather was going to be like on the European continent for them to do bombing raid. So he spends more than a year on the Arctic Circle with just 5 guys. They got mail 3 times during that entire time they were there. And so a few years ago, there was some kind of a project from the Smithsonian where interviewers were going around to World War II vets to talk to them about their experience as part of the war effort as veterans. And so I went to my dad's apartment when those interviewers, when those interviewers came to talk to him about his experience. And their opening question was, what was it like to be on the Arctic Circle for a year? Well, that's so open-ended. I'm all for open-ended questions. I'm all for that. But that one was so open-ended. Here's my dad, where I just watched him, and this is being videotaped. He takes off his glasses, he rubs his eyes, he kind of, hems and haws, he clears a bunch of phlegm from his throat. He does a whole bunch of things just trying to get his hands around how do you answer a question like, what was it like? The short answer is, it's not like anything. So that would have been the short answer. But I mean, it was just paralyzing, and it was awkward, and I'm just standing in the kitchen watching this and going, dude, ask a better question. Ask a better question. Nothing is like being in the Arctic with 5 guys. a year? You got to ask it.
I remember that reading that in your book, and your warning against asking these yes no type of questions, or these like, hey, how was it over there in North Pole? Yeah, it was cold. There you go. That's the answer.
Exactly. Lots of snow, lots of ice, some seals, some polar bears. Next question.
So in your book, you have the section about okay, go, and you give wonderful examples, and I'm just going to give one. I'm actually going to use one over here, which is the Noah Adams question, which is, and I'm going to kind of reframe over here in context of your book, which is when you started writing this book, how did you think it was going to come out, or how did you think it's going to turn out, and how did it turn out in the end?
Yeah, no, the reason that's such an important question is that I didn't start out writing a book about interviewing. This was not the plan. But that's why that's such a great question, because most of life doesn't turn out the way you think it's going to. And it was the same case with this book, and oftentimes just with an interview. What I had done is that I thought, okay, I've been a journalist for a long time. I've taught journalism. I've taught creative writing. I probably have something to say in a book about writing, and how to be a better writer, basically. And so I thought I had some wisdom to share. So I put together a book proposal, sample chapter, outlines of everything that would go into this, on basically about how to be a better writer. And I had a literary agent who shopped it around to all the major publishing houses, even the medium ones, and they all said, "No, we actually have books about writing. Stephen King did a really good one. Anne Lamott did a really good one. William Zinsser did a really good one. Ray Bradbury did a really good one, and nobody's ever heard of you, so probably this wouldn't do all that well." But here was where an editor at HarperCollins, I thought, showed just a little bit of kind of maybe risk. She puts at the bottom of her rejection, she says, "Yeah, it's well written. We like it. We like you, but we already have Mary Carr." She says, "But you did a chapter about interviewing and the importance of being able to talk to people. You seem to know something about interviewing. Would you consider doing a book about interviewing?" So I got on the phone with that editor, and we chatted some, and we started kind of brainstorming of what would a book about interviewing look like. And this is the result of it. So I owe all sorts of gratitude to Hannah Robinson from HarperCollins for seeing a glimpse of something that was not in what my original idea was. And so the result is this book about interviewing. She had the idea, not me. I was able to adapt to it and come up with something, but this is not what the original plan was.
I can definitely subscribe to that. I know even like with this podcast, taking it, I had some ideas where this is going to go, and it's constant refinement. I feel like every episode, it gives you an opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, what else can I do differently? Or where is it, what is it that the audience wants? What is it that I want to talk about as well? Because primarily for this podcast, I want to talk to interesting people. And the premise of the whole thing is find interesting people, listen to them, learn from their experiences, and then share those with others. And in my book, that's a shortcut to knowledge, that experience, having like such as yourself, 40 years of journalistic experience, tremendous amount. And talking to you is phenomenal, because I learn new things. I mean, I read your book, but I am going to also try to tease out some of the things that you didn't cover in the book. And
Sure.
One of them is I would like to ask you about your opinion on where's the world going with, with YouTube, with podcasting. What are your thoughts on that? And because in the past, it used to be, journalism was more closely guarded. It was, newspapers, it was the media. Right now, it seems like anyone, even someone like me, can crank out a podcast. What are your thoughts on where society is going with all this overwhelming number of podcasts and media available to listen to everyone?
Yeah, I have thought a lot about this, and it takes away all of the podcasts, the YouTube stuff, the social media, all of this takes away some of the elitism of what mainstream news media has enjoyed over the years. And that has its pluses and it has its minuses. The pluses is that we aren't necessarily just subject to the not opinions, but the judgment of traditional news media, where there used to be just a few voices. At least when I was growing up, there were far fewer voices informing us of what was going on in the world. Now, anybody can be a journalist, anybody can be a storyteller, and that has, I think, some real merits to it. The downside, of course, is that there's less emphasis on verification. There's less emphasis on being factually accurate. And so there's the opportunity for distortion and misinformation and manipulation and propaganda. And we're seeing that clearly in some of the things that are out there. So I think these things kind of go in cycles. People used to say when radio first was developed, oh no, anybody will be able to broadcast things on the radio, and then television upset that, and then cable television upset the main networks, and so there's this constant kind of broadening of voices. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. What we have to decide as a society is how do we sort out what are the trustworthy voices and what are not the trustworthy voices. And I think we're in the process as a society now of trying to figure that out. What will we put up with in the name of freedom? Will we put up with lies and distortion and manipulation and propaganda? Or will we try to put some kind of standards on this open communication that's going on? So that's what we're in the middle of. And nothing's ever, we're kind of at this spot now, and so we're just everything's in flux, everything's in motion. The universe is expanding. I'm an optimist. So there are a lot of people in my world of journalism and in the broader world of communication who are just pulling their hair out. I'm not. We're going to sort this out.
I'm thinking that maybe just the market itself is going to wean and weed out the sources that they don't like. I'm thinking that it's going to be sort of like a natural progression where people will trust certain podcasters more, and time will only tell, right? Anybody can produce something, and you can try to fact check it, but only time will tell if that person has integrity. But there's certainly a huge variety of new voices and new people, and it's almost like the market is deciding who's popular. The sad part is that a lot of it is focusing on drama, a lot on conflict, things that are easily grabbing the headlines, right?
Right, yeah. It doesn't lend itself, even the world you're in podcasting. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. The world of podcasting does a better job of dealing with complexity and nuance than maybe headline news. You know, the stuff where or the clickbait or the those headlines that start with "You won't believe what this video is going to show." You know, those are such a colossal distraction that I don't even click on them, and neither should most people. But podcasting and certain kinds of video actually are pretty good at getting past the cliches and getting past the sensational and getting past just the things that will only jar you, you know. So from that standpoint, I think that's progress. I will say this about certain websites and probably cable television, is that everything can't be breaking news, and everything can't be the most important story, you know, of the modern era. You do that often enough, and people just get numb to it, and they just start tuning it out, or they're in a constant state of fear. So that's I don't think that's good for democracy. But I do think, to the point you brought up earlier, the modern era of communications has opened us up to voices that under no other circumstances would we have heard. Minority voices, people out on the margins, people who we would have never paid attention to, now have a platform. Personally, I think that's a good thing, because then it isn't, we're not just being subjected to a few voices who may or may not be telling us all that we need to know.
I certainly agree with that. There's definitely a place in the market to explore and find those voices as well. They can do it themselves and get on the podcast. My mission in this podcast is to find those gems, to find those diamonds in the rough who are interesting people and can bring a different perspective to help reshape how I view things and how the public can view things. And I totally agree with you. That is just such a beneficial aspect of this. Yes, there's going to be more chaff in this whole space where there's going to be more, but who are we to judge? Some of them, may seem to be trivial podcasts or topics, but if it works for someone, if someone gets something out of it and they find it and they tune into it and they benefit from it, they get some kind of value out of it, then that's a plus in my book. The other side of it is what you mentioned, which is the propaganda, the misuse of this technology, of manipulation of public opinion. And because it's still in such early stage of how the public consumes this and deals with it, it's going to be sort of like maybe a natural attrition process where like those who are not good enough will basically just go away because people will just not listen and not watch them.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's one other dimension, though, that is harmful, that I think intuitively you know this, but it's worth mentioning, and that is people who exploit or just traffic in outrage. This is like the everything can't be breaking news. Also, everything that happens today can't just be something that should fill you with fear or outrage or whatever. But there are some who their whole market is people who are on the verge of being outraged by something, and that's not sustainable, and it's also harmful. And I think probably, as you mentioned, is one of those things that people will ultimately say, everything isn't there just trying to offend me, and maybe we'll get that one sorted out eventually.
Let's talk about interviewing. Let's get back to the topic of interviewing and your book and your experiences with interviewing people. One of the questions that lingered in my mind as I was reading your book and the numerous examples that you give in it, what were some of the interviews that you were in that went rogue and you recovered? What were some of those surprises, good and bad, in which you were like, wow, okay, I didn't think that would go that way, and then you still managed to steer out and clear, and then kind of salvage the conversation, the interview?
Yeah, I the first one that comes to mind is the great writer Ray Bradbury. He doesn't like to call himself, or he didn't like to call himself, a science fiction writer, but that's sort of where he gets pigeonholed in the marketplace. But he was so interesting and so deep and so funny, and he absolutely did not care what question I asked him. So I'd ask him a question and he would maybe begin to answer it, and then that would remind him of something, and then he would kind of spin off on some kind of a rant. And it was so good and so entertaining that while he was doing this, and again, it's being televised, so I have a defined amount of time, and I've got all these questions I want to get into with him. But I had this notion while he was spinning off on some sort of a rant, and he was kind of this combination of Mel Brooks and Albert Einstein. He was so funny, and he was just so out of control it appeared to be in his responses, but it was just so good and so deep that I actually had the thought of, I could try to rein this in and say, Mr. Bradbury, that's really interesting, but what I really was asking was this. I could do that. Or the thought that came to me was, nobody actually paid to come to this interview to hear me ask questions. They paid to come to this interview to hear Ray Bradbury. And so if Ray Bradbury is spinning off into some wild orbit, that's okay. That's okay. So there's a really interesting ego thing that occurs with probably with every interview. And I'm sure you've seen some interviews on television where you thought to yourself, dude, shut up. Let the woman answer your question, right? I didn't want to be that guy, right? So I thought, no, they're here to hear Ray Bradbury. Let's let him go. Now, if I were doing a story that was something that had a topic, that had a journalistic kind of a need, and I just needed him to speak about what he thinks about space exploration, or what he thinks about colonizing Mars, or whatever, and he wasn't answering that. If I needed that for my story, then I'd bring him back, and I would rein that in a little bit and say, wow, that's really interesting. Now let's go back to talking about Mars. I think you can do that without being rude and condescending and without grandstanding. But it depends on your purpose. The purpose for having Ray Bradbury at our writers' symposium was so that people could hear Ray Bradbury, not so that I could get answers to my questions, right? So I had a different purpose then. And now I just thought, did I answer your question? I kind of lost the thread there, Adrian.
You did.
What are you asking?
You did. How to recover from some of those maybe questions that when your guest answers and it just kind of veers off, and you want to put it back on track, or you it feels like it's not going well, and you're recovering. And I had some experience, like I'm kind of going with the flow, and so if it goes too far off, I will just kind of realign it. But I like the space in which we can explore different topics, because in the end, it's about your guest, right? And I do like what you said. Yeah, I do like what you said initially, which is like you over prepare. You have a list of questions in your head or written down that you want to ask, but don't be attached to them. If the confluence happens and you get to ask all those questions, that's great. But if your guest is taking you on an interesting journey, and that adds value to the viewers, to you, and to the viewers who are listening or watching your show, I think that's my kind of the top threshold. That's my goal in the back of my mind to always cling to. Adds value. Yeah, let them go.
Exactly, I think so too. But you're constantly gauging this in your head while the interview is going on of what's most important here, and is it to get to the heart of this particular issue, or is it to just have our people kind of be exposed to the greatness of this writer, of this thinker, of this cultural icon? So it is kind of a dance you have to do. With the Ray Bradbury interview, I had somebody come up to me afterwards and say, well, that had to be the easiest interview you've ever done because you didn't have to ask any questions. It's, excuse me, on the one hand, that's true. I didn't have to ask many questions, but on the other hand, my head was, all the wheels were spinning at a high rate in my head while he was going off on that rant, because I'm thinking, okay, I'm not gonna have time to ask this question. We don't have time to get into that topic. How long do I let him go? So there's this whole inner dialogue that's going on while he's doing his thing that on the one hand, that's harder because you have to know when to interject, when to let it go, when to guide it a little bit. So when the person said it had to be the easiest interview that I've done, actually it wasn't that easy because I'm constantly monitoring and I'm constantly thinking, what do I do now? So it may have looked easy just because I didn't have to say that much, but I was trying to just figure out, okay, how are we gonna land this plane, basically?
I'm always keeping in mind what my wife said to me, like, make sure you listen more than talk. Don't steal the show. It's not about you. Ask good questions, but, don't steal the show. And so now from a different bucket of questions, do you watch YouTube and or listen to podcasts, and what are some of the favorite ones that you listen to?
I listen to some. I'm a big fan of Ira Glass on This American Life. And I like how they get into issues and complexity, and they don't just kind of fall for the easy answer on things. One of the things that a program like This American Life can do is take an issue or take an event, and they look at it like a gemstone, and they say, well, let's look at it from this direction. Now let's look at it from that direction. Let's look at it from up here. And they don't fall into that sort of false cliche that there are two sides to every story. What they kind of promote is the sense that there are probably 30 sides to every story. And that's what I think a good podcast that deals with issues or current events or human drama or something like that can do. So I like that one. I listen to sort of a scatter shot of podcasts so I can kind of get a sense of what is out there, and I watch some on YouTube, and some are interesting, some are not. But I don't listen to as many things online as our college students do. That may be a generational thing, I don't know, but It's not necessarily how I get most of my information, but I do pay attention.
Hmm. In some of the ones that you found in your sort of scattershot approach to sampling different podcasts or YouTube videos or something that you stumbled upon where there was an interview going or a conversation, what are some of the mistakes that most common mistakes that you see people do when they do these, these podcasts or YouTube videos?
Yeah, no, that's actually looking at how you would want things to go differently is a really important way. But before I get to that, let me bring up one other. I really like Krista Tippett's program called On Being with Minnesota Public Radio. There's one where, as opposed to Mark Maron, the comedian, I like his stuff, but if you just if you hold Krista Tippett's On Being and Mark Maron's WTF podcast, if you hold those together and just listen to how much the host speaks, you'll be amazed at how little Krista Tippett actually says, and she's okay with silence. And I don't know, just I've never done a study on Mark Maron's, but it feels like he does 80% of the talking. And that's what people want, because he is funny. He is funny. But if I were a guest on Mark Maron's podcast, I would think, I don't know, will I get a word in edgewise? So that is one of the things that I would say for people to pay attention to is, how much does the host actually listen to the answer? And as I mentioned in my book, Talk to Me, active listening means you're really paying attention to what the person is saying. You're not so focused on what is my next question. And that's where we get into that difference between an interrogation and a conversation that we started out talking about today. So when hosts or interviewers aren't listening, and somebody might say something that, if you're really listening, you just say, wait, what? What did you just say? I think that's a perfectly legitimate question for an interviewer to ask, whether it's live or not. What did you just say? Then that person develops it a little bit further. But if they say something that's a little kind of off kilter and you're thinking about what your next question is, well, you've missed something. You've missed an opportunity to kind of go off on a little bit of a rabbit trail that might be really, really interesting and might not be something that they've talked about publicly before. So I do think one of the mistakes that hosts often make is that they aren't really listening to what the person is saying. And they've got their own agenda and they want to, make sure that they get their agenda out there.
Yeah, it's I find it that interesting when I have a set of kind of questions that I want to find out. I'm always keeping myself in check so that I don't just have this agenda of like, all right, I'm going to crank out another show. I'm going to ask all these questions and we're done. I always am listening to the answer and see where that answer can take us next, and kind of develop into a story. Right.
And I do the same thing. I think about interviews like stories. And that's why I try to put questions in a certain order. You start out with, in this way, maybe kind of an attention-getting kind of way, like any good story would be, or maybe you start out with a chronology, like some stories would be, and then you just kind of get more and more, I think, interesting, maybe more complex. And if you've got a difficult question you want to ask somebody, then you kind of get to that. And in a story, that would be sort of the climactic point of the story. And then you've got kind of that falling off of action. So I look at interviews the same way I look at stories.
When you talk to people and you had celebrities, you had big names on in your symposium, I have two questions. One is, who is one of your, and I'm going to put you on a spot a little bit. Who is one of your favorite ones
Sure.
to speak with? And the second one is, when you do have those big name celebrities sitting in front of you, outside of being, starstruck or just, trying to, I guess, make him comfortable, keep him comfortable, at a cost of not being yourself, not being as authentic, because maybe in a just regular conversation you would have asked some questions, but because this is a celebrity, or this is like you're going gentle on them, or you're being diplomatic, or how did you find out that sometimes you had to be like that, or were you just plowing through like, nope, this is me, this is Dean Nelson, and I'm just going to ask this because that's just me?
Interviewing people that I really admire is that, and
Yeah,
do I
that's a
still
fair
ask
way
them
of
tough
yeah, that's a fair way of reframing it. Yes, people that you admire, not being starstruck by a celebrity sort of status, and still being able to deliver the questions that you want to ask as you, to be authentic and not be kind of like pandering to their status.
Yeah. No, I'll ask you. I'll give you a specific example of this. One of my journalistic heroes is a man named Bill Moyers. So public
Love him.
broadcasting. You're maybe way too young to know who Bill Moyers is, but anyway, in my view, he's sort of the Edward R. Murrow of the modern era. And we were able to get him to come to the Writers' Symposium. Well, I think he's the model of all great journalism, in my view. And so in my preparation for him, though, I discovered that, while he was also the press secretary for President Lyndon Johnson there for a little while, during the ratcheting up of the Vietnam War. And I had a tough question I wanted to ask him about that. And yet I knew I was in the presence of greatness itself. So there are some people who think, one of the great broadcasters of the modern age was Walter Cronkite, and of course he was. But I just thought the person who did so much more of holding the powerful accountable in his journalism, and getting into the depth of issues and getting into complexity and nuance, like we talked about before, it was Bill Moyers. I just don't think there's anybody else like him. So we have him there, and while I'm interviewing him, Adrian, I just had this sense of, I am in the presence of greatness itself. And yet, I was moving toward a question that I thought was going to kind of put him on the spot. He had been very critical of our country's actions and activities after the 9/11 attacks. He'd been very publicly critical and had all sorts of guests and things like that on his PBS shows, airing that criticism and talking about that. For instance, going into Iraq under circumstances that we found out later just weren't true. And yet, we went into the Vietnam War. There was an inciting incident for our ramping up our activity in the Vietnam War, something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which apparently never happened, right? And so I drew a parallel between Bill Moyers being the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, using that as a reason to go into Vietnam, and the weapons of mass destruction, the connection of Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden and all that sort of stuff, things that just also had never happened. And so I drew a parallel for him and said, how is what we did going into Iraq any different from how we went into Vietnam on information that was false? Now, I didn't accuse him of perpetuating some false information, but he was part of that administration, and he was the press secretary. And so he was totally cool with it, unflappable. He gave, I thought, a brilliant, deep response, but didn't seem defensive about it at all. Come on, when you think about somebody that smart and that deep, they've thought about this. You weren't the first one to bring this up to their attention, and so he was ready for it. And he gave a what I thought was just a good, honest response about governments making mistakes, and that they should own it. And that took us in a whole different direction, which I thought was wonderful. So that was one case where I was so smitten with his greatness and how, as a journalist, I would aspire to be like Bill Moyers. But I also wanted to hold his feet to the fire on something that I felt like he needed to be accountable for. And he was okay with it. So that worked out.
There's that moment of, oh my gosh, did I just shot myself in the face with this question and get destroyed by this celebrity or this high status person, or will they respect that I asked that question because it does probe certain questions or certain topics? And of course there's a fine line between those, right? There's like, you can be just annoyingly probing and taking it to the extreme, and then that is just not fun. But you can also make a thoughtful and still very deep and controversial question and ask your guest, and not be, and not transmit that feeling of like, oh, I'm just going to try to probe you to death over here and put you on a spot to make you feel, put you in a bad lighting. And I think those who can recognize those two, distinguish those two, they'll respond accordingly.
I think you're right. There's a big difference between an accusation and a tough question. Those are two completely different things. One is you've already made up your mind. If it's an accusation, you've already made up your mind about what a jerk this person is, or what a bad decision this person made, or whatever. If it's a tough question, you're laying it out there and saying, explain this to me. I'm seeing it this way, but explain to me. Am I right? Am I wrong? But let's dig into this a little bit. Those are two different things.
Yeah, and you cover this in your book very well, which is asking those questions which lend themselves for the guest to tell a story, explain something to me. How did you do something, and how did you grow with something? How did you things that take you back to that memory, to that time, so they can kind of go back in time and then explore that and share that as a story. Those are, when I was reading this book, I was like, wow, those are really great questions, because they open up a possibility that your question can open up more than just the question itself, in a sense. Just like they will tell a story, and out of that story you will find out more information than even your question could have actually asked in the beginning. So those are wonderful tips you have.
And what you're after there is just sort of a shared humanity with that other person. You've left the realm of just getting information, and we're into this deeper area of saying, I want to know you as a human being, and I want to know what kind of shared humanity that we might be able to explore, so that we can just understand the deeper human condition. And that's when those questions where you get into a story, you get into an anecdote, that's where you really start to feel that sense of shared humanity.
I totally agree. I have those moments, and there are just moments to savor when you finally get to the person behind, the name. When you get to that understanding that, we all live this movie that's going to end one day, and once you get that recognition that you too are just a human being and you are on this journey, then there's some kind of a magical moment that I found several times that these conversations become like emotional because they're not just like this facade anymore. They're becoming a
Right.
really good conversation, and that's why I love these long form conversations, because then you have the time and the platform to kind of explore those things and get to know the other person beyond what you can read in a
Right.
book, beyond the public persona that you get. And I think that's another benefit of the internet and podcasting, that it allows
Sure.
for that.
On the topic of that, this very thing, the philosopher and kind of modern guru Ram Dass, who died just recently, he had this
Yeah.
great quote where he said, "All we're really trying to do is help each other find their way home." And when we get into a story that reveals that sort of shared humanity, and you get to know somebody beyond the curated Instagram life that they've kind of posed up there, and you see that this person has some of the same issues perhaps you do, and maybe has gone a little bit farther down the road from you, and can really, that's where Ram Dass, I think, is right. We're just trying to help each other get home, and
Yeah,
that's part of the depth of what you're trying to do with your podcast.
that's why it feels just so great when I have these conversations and we finally get to that point where we feel like we are both on this journey to discover ourselves and to peel off these layers of culture that's kind of laid on us. And then when that beautiful moment happens, you're like really on the same wavelength, and magical moment happens. Love Ram Dass.
Yeah.
Going back to Bill Moyers, I loved Bill Moyers' interview with Joseph Campbell. I think that was a fantastic.
Oh my God.
I
Maybe
have,
one of the best conversations ever.
yeah.
I'm totally with you. That was absolutely a game changer for me and for a lot of people. I mean, I love Joseph Campbell anyway, but then to see him get into the weeds with Moyers, oh my gosh. I'm totally with you.
When I was looking and I found your book, and I have the whole series of Bill Moyers interviews, interview with Joseph Campbell, because there's like I don't know how many hours, several hours that they talk about mythology and storytelling, and the journey, the hero's journey, and and I found your book. I'm like, those are like my two big tools that I'm using right now to learn how to like have these conversations. But that's kind of like the structure and skeleton that some of these questions that you have in your book, which is great. They allow you some of that freedom and maybe sense of I have something to always, like a skeleton, something to go back to if I get stuck somewhere, and that's how I kind of treated that. And examples that you give in a book that that kind of like just sit in the back of your head, and you're like, oh, okay, well, if this happens, not all is lost. We can still salvage it. Here's a way of doing it. So again, it's your experiences that you shared, or just examples that are helping me, at least, in when I'm talking to someone, because I always have something to lean on. But I do strive on these honest conversations, these flowing conversations that sometimes even get emotional when someone taps into a deeply seated root of something that really connects them, and then I really peel off that layer, and I see that person. Now I know why you're doing what you're doing. Now I know why you're motivated to do that, and and that's super revealing. And I think that's what I'm kind of enjoying in this the most. But let me ask you the second question, which is, who was one of your favorite guests on your the Writers' Symposium?
Well, other than Bill Moyers and Ray Bradbury, for reasons that we've already gotten into, because again, remember, with Ray Bradbury, and actually the same with Bill Moyers, I make a point in the book that somebody will control the interview. Whatever interview you're doing, somebody's going to control that interview, and I'm saying it always has to be you, the interviewer, right? But with both Ray Bradbury and Bill Moyers, I lost control of the interview. They just took it over. They're so good, and I let it go. I just let it go. So those, even though I was so prepared and I didn't get at all my questions with either one of them, I was so happy to hand over, the control of that thing to them, that I thought that made it pretty special. Others that I think, I don't know, the writer Anne Lamott, I've had her at the Writers' Symposium 3 times now, because again, she's so deep and she's so funny, and there's a repartee. We've stayed friends over the years, and there's kind of that, you can tell when you've got a deep connection with some people and you just want to stay in touch with them. She would be one of them. Mary Carr was another one. She was fabulous. So there are some that have been super entertaining. Michael Eric Dyson, for instance, I asked him a question and he did impressions of Snoop Dogg and Martin Luther King Jr. and Bill Cosby and Barack Obama, all within about a minute. And it was awesome. It was just awesome. So those ones, and that's why kind of the reference I made earlier to, it's like going to a jazz club. When they kind of take off and have their own life on something, those are kind of your favorite kinds of experiences. So I know this is going to sound like a cliche, but I can explain it. When you ask me who is my favorite, if I have a favorite, other than those ones that I just mentioned, I would say it's whoever I'm preparing for now. That's kind of my favorite writer, because I'm so immersed in that person, in their writing, in who they are, in what their craft has been over the years, how they've evolved. So I'm getting ready to interview Alice Walker just in a couple of weeks, and I'm just in awe of her. And the night before, she's going to be here. The great travel writer and thinker and philosopher Pico Iyer is going to be here, and I've loved preparing for him. So I could almost say my favorite interview is the one that I'm about to do. And the reason I think that isn't just a cliche or isn't just a dodge is that I feel the same way about stories that I'm working on. Whatever story or whatever book I'm working on at the time, personally, I think it's the most interesting thing I've ever done. And, so I get just so locked into it and immersed in it that I just love it. I just love it. So I kind of feel that way about interviews too.
And I feel a little bit guilty because this was a little cheeky question with respect to the favorite, because yes, all of them are interesting, and although some of them may seem like their favorite, which is what you just said, if you just focus that on the moment, on the present moment, with every one of your guests, everyone has an interesting story and has some value. So all of them are, super valuable. Favorite, maybe just in a sense of how conversation, was flowing. That's the only thing that I can kind of say which one was more like favorite, in the sense that the conversation was flowing. And even doing these conversations over technology, as we're doing right now, remote recording, is a different experience than when I have guests in the studio, because that proximity of being in the same space, being able to kind of go back and forth faster. There is no delay. You can respond to things. Over here, I there's always something that I wait for someone to kind of give me a hint that they're finishing their answer, and it's kind of more curated in that sense, and not as natural as in the studio. So I definitely like the ones in the studios, recording in the studio, than the remote ones. But at the same time, the remote ones allow me to talk to guests such as yourself, hundreds or thousands of miles away, speaking with interesting book authors in other countries that can give me perspective that I cannot get locally, and that's the beauty of that. Yeah. So it's a give or take.
You can't fly everybody into the studio.
Well, next time when you're going to be here in Utah, I definitely want to invite you to the studio and have a conversation on this. But I'm not going to let you go just yet. And I do have a question for you with respect to teaching journalism at your university, and what you see with younger folks in that studying journalism, and what are some of
Yeah.
the some of the takeaway tips that you give them as they are getting ready to enter the workforce and work as journalists, podcasters, YouTubers, what have you? What are some of your top kind of tips for them?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and it has evolved over the years. I've taught journalism at this school for 35 years, and a lot has changed in journalism in 35 years, right? So students coming in now, I think, have to be shown the value of good journalism in a free society. I think they come in now, 18 or 19-year-olds now are coming in with a certain question of why would I want to go into be part of the news media when nobody trusts it, or it's all kind of Orwellian newspeak or whatever. Giving some history as to journalism has always had this love-hate relationship with the audience, whether it was the political partisanship in the early days of this country. We think that the partisanship in the news media is this new phenomenon, and we've never experienced this, and what are we going to do? Actually, if you go back to American history, oh my gosh, it was very partisan. There was a different news media outlet for every political party, and there were several political parties back then. So everything was seen through the prism of that political ideology. So this is not a new thing, what we're seeing here. So giving some historical maybe context is really important. Showing that an aggressive and free news media, by free I mean unfettered by government, is the only way democracy works. It's the only way. So showing the students the importance of a free and unfettered and aggressive news media. So I have to cover more context to kind of bring them up to why is this important. But then there are a couple of things that are so invigorating for students to learn about news media. One is you can do it at so many platforms. You can do it on social media. You can do it in Instagram posts. You can do it in long form, kinds of things. So we call our journalism major a multimedia journalism major, and because you have to be able to tell stories in a variety of ways. So they get pretty energized by that. They get really energized by journalism gives you the front row of history being made, and so that's amazing. The stuff I've been able to do, the places I've been able to go and report on, just because I'm a member of the news media, is something that no other profession gives you that kind of experience. But I also think there's a tremendous amount of interest today in holding the powerful accountable. That's always been part of our role in the news media in this country. So holding powerful entities accountable, whether it's corporations or governments or individuals or whomever, that kind of accountability and having a part in that is an amazing responsibility that we get to work in. There are two other things that I think are really important to get at your question. One is I just think we have a responsibility as human beings and as journalists simply to bear witness, to just say, here's what's going on in the world, or here's a person you ought to know. Here's a person that you ought to get to know. And to just be able to tell the world about this situation or about this event or about this individual, that gives us this opportunity as an audience then to just understand the world better. I mean, we understand the world by story. We've always been that way. And we then, as journalists, get to be storytellers to help us understand how the world works. So then here's the piece, though, that I really have to drive home. And that is, there is so much unverified information that gets reported that I spend a lot of time with our students, and so do my colleagues in journalism, on the importance of verification and the importance of skepticism. I think skepticism is a virtue, where when we hear something that somebody says, or we read a report or something, the first thing we ought to say is, I wonder if that's true. Not say, I know that it's not. I know that they're lying. I know that it's fake news. But to say, I wonder, and then go to the extra work to try to verify it. So here's what I tell our students. Nobody's going to remember who was first in the reporting of an event. But everybody's going to remember who was wrong. And so I'd rather have our students working in a news organization maybe take a little more time to make that extra phone call, to do that extra interview, to dig a little beyond the surface and find out if what everybody is going so nuts over is actually true. If we do a little more than that, more of that, we might stay out of trouble a little more. So that verification, taking the extra time. I mean, the market is on the immediate and on the clickbait and all that sort of stuff. But as you and I talked about at the very beginning of this interview, these things will sort themselves out. And the public, I believe, will demand ultimately information that they can trust, not information that will make them fearful or outraged. That's where I'm pushing our journalism program today. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I mean, those are the key takeaway points for a budding journalist to keep in mind as they do what they do. And linking to that is a question: how do you find the truth out there with the overwhelming amount of information that's available and misinformation that's trolling the internet and news media as well? I mean, it gets into all sorts of outlets. How do you find what's true out there?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. One thing I do really emphasize with our students is there's a difference between fake news and getting something wrong. There are times when a story will just have a fact. It happened on Tuesday, not on Wednesday. But that just because you got a fact wrong doesn't mean we can't trust the media. So I guess to get at your question, you have to find voices that are trustworthy, and that takes some work on the part of the public. Who are the voices that I can trust? Who are the ones who are just trying to tell me what's going on instead of trying to grandstand and become the next big thing through their own ego mania? So how do we develop trustworthy sources, voices? Walter Lippmann, who was one of the great journalism voices almost 100 years ago, has this great quote where it says, "The truth will emerge, not in one account, not maybe in two accounts, maybe not in today's account, but over time, the truth will emerge. And having a culture and a mood that encourages that truth to emerge, that's what I think is important for audiences, for our students, for journalists. Here's the way I think about truthfulness. On the one hand, we can fall for lies, and we have fallen for lies as a nation, as a species, for forever. But I have a driveway outside my garage here that I paved it not too long ago. And I could not believe it, that a dandelion found its way somehow underneath that pavement and all that soil preparation and all that concrete, found a way up into the sunlight. And here in this whole sheet of concrete, here's a dandelion. And I know this is going to sound like a cliche, but I think the truth is like that. The truth pushes its way, all these attempts to cover it up, to pave it over, to pretend it's this way and not that way. Ultimately, the truth finds its way toward the light, and that's what we need to cultivate and make a market for that will encourage that kind of truth to emerge.
It's funny that you mention that because as we spoke about internet and how a lot of sources of information can, just the access to information can lead into misinformation, can easily be the avenue for the misinformation to be pushing throughout to the social consciousness. At the same time, you have multiple accounts, an easier way of collecting that data. So people with phones can literally become journalists on the spot, and it has happened many times already. And then you get multiple accounts of that, and that shapes the truth versus just one person saying like, "Oh, some event happened. Here's breaking news, and this is what's really happening." Now suddenly you have a plethora of different sources that can corroborate that and support or even change perspective, or even just fact correct, because it might be just from that perspective it seemed like that was the truth, but now we have more information, more data points, and then now this is what we think the truth is.
Right. And you could say the same thing about government saying this is what happened, this is the official count of what happened, but you've got all these people with cell phones who are saying actually that's not what happened. Here are a bunch of different perspectives, and it's those multiple perspectives that's going to really let the truth emerge. Government is really good at trying to pave over what really happened.
Sometimes it's just imperfect information. So just one source of something, and then our natural biases kick in because we have all of those, and we have a tendency of like, oh, this is bias confirmation. I looked for a nugget of information, and now I found it. Therefore, my theory is right, and I don't look for anything else. I don't need anything else. I just shaped my opinion. But with more data points, we have an opportunity to revisit that, and that's what makes a good analytical person and a journalist, which all of them should be good analysts, to kind of look at different perspectives and really try to shape what's in the middle instead of just one extreme or the other extreme.
Well, and it's really up to audiences, in my view. I put the responsibility back on the public to not just get one perspective. If you're used to getting all of your information from just this one news organization, you're really leaving yourself open for manipulation and propaganda. But if you get your information from this place and maybe this place, then you're probably going to see a more complete version of events, as opposed to that kind of confirmation bias.
So you're optimistic about the future of journalism?
I am, because what we know about journalism today is going to be different from what it will be 2 years from now. But will there always be a need for storytellers, for people who will be able to tell us what happened and hold powerful groups accountable, and help us understand what's going on in the world, there's always going to be a need for that. I don't care whether they do it on their phones or through a chip in their brains. There's always going to be a need for the culture to have truthful storytellers. There's also a role for fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Film and all of that. That's a different kind of truth. I'm talking about a truth that's verified, that is helping us understand what is going on in the world today. So yes, that's why I am an optimist about the future of journalism, because I know that as a species, we depend on stories. And we depend on stories to understand how the world works. And journalism can help us get there.
Well, Dean, thank you so much for bestowing some of your wisdom. I am a big fan of your book. And I thank you for helping me out on my journey with your wonderful book. And for those of you podcasters who are getting into this, and whether it's YouTube or podcasting, a book by Dean Nelson, Talk to Me, How to Ask Better Questions, Get Better Answers, and Interview Anyone Like a Pro, has been an invaluable resource for me to start me on my journey. And I hope you got something out of this conversation. I know we were a little bit all over the place, but that's my fault, because I just go on tangents. But I think you had some interesting. I hope you enjoyed it, Dean. And I always ask my guests to introduce me to one or two other interesting people that they find interesting, who would be good guests, who could share some of their experiences and their knowledge and wisdom and add some value and transmit it to others, viewers of this podcast. Who would that be for you if you wanted to recommend someone for me to talk to?
Are you familiar with a guy named Donald Miller?
No, not yet.
He's got a company in Nashville called Story Brand. And he's a really, really fine writer anyway. And we had him at our writers symposium. And then he's kind of moved from being a writer to helping individuals or organizations or companies or whatever kind of discover what their story is, mm-hmm. and help communicate that to audiences. So on the one hand, it's a kind of marketing, but it's deeper than that. He's communicating deeper ideas. I would recommend you connect with Donald Miller.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Again, what a wonderful conversation. I hope to speak with you again. I hope to one day meet you in person, perhaps at your symposium, or perhaps when you're going to be visiting Utah over here. The powder is always here. The powder is always ready for you. And until then, I'll be in touch with you. And thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
I look forward to our next conversation. You asked really good questions, by the way, and I'll come find you in Utah. We'll hang out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dean.